There is a city at the bottom of the sea. Dive into the harbor of Alexandria today, and you will swim past sphinxes, fallen columns, and stone blocks the size of trucks. Pieces of a lighthouse that was once one of the 7 wonders of the world. Somewhere beneath that same water lie parts of the royal quarter where Cleopatra lived and ruled. And somewhere in the city above, in a location no one has ever found, stood an institution built around one of the most audacious ambitions in human history, to gather every text its rulers could obtain, to hold, in one place, as much of human knowledge as the world would surrender. We call it the Library of Alexandria, and we have been arguing about how we lost it for 2,000 years. This is the story of the city that tried to hold everything, and what it actually means to lose it. It begins with a man drawing lines in the sand with barley flour. In the year 331 before Christ. Chapter 1. The line in the sand. Picture a stretch of empty coastline on the western edge of the Nile Delta. It is early in the year, 331 BC. There is a small coastal settlement here called Rakotis. Fishermen and farmers living between a limestone ridge and the sea. Offshore, about a mile out, a long, narrow island called Pharos breaks the waves. Behind the coast lies a freshwater lake. Between the lake and the sea runs a strip of solid ground. And on this particular morning, a group of men is walking across it, and one of them is deciding the future of the Mediterranean world. He is 25 years old. He has already beaten the Persian armies at Granicus and Issus, taken the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean, and marched into Egypt without a fight, because the Egyptians resented their Persian rulers so deeply that they welcomed him as a liberator. His name is Alexander, king of Macedon, and he has stopped at this empty beach because he sees something here that nobody else can see yet. What he sees is a machine for moving wealth. Look at the geography the way he looked at it. The island of Pharos sits offshore like a natural breakwater. Connect it to the mainland with a causeway, and you instantly create 2 protected harbors, one facing east and one facing west, usable in almost any weather. Behind the city, the lake connects through channels to the Nile, and the Nile is the richest agricultural engine on Earth, producing grain surpluses that no other region of the ancient world could match. A city on this spot would stand at the exact point where the wealth of Egypt meets the shipping lanes of the Mediterranean, a vast share of everything flowing out of Africa, and everything flowing in from Greece, from Asia Minor, from everywhere, could be drawn across its docks. The Parisii understood their river crossing. The founders of Boston understood their harbor. Alexander understood this beach. Great cities almost never begin as accidents. They begin when somebody reads a map correctly. According to the ancient biographer Plutarch, writing about 4 centuries after the event, Alexander had been thinking about Homer. Plutarch tells the story that Alexander dreamed of an old man reciting lines from the Odyssey, lines that mention the island of Pharos, and woke convinced that the dream was pointing him to this coast. Is the story true? We cannot know. Plutarch was working from earlier sources that are now lost, and stories about Alexander grew more miraculous with every generation that retold them. What we can say is that the ancient world believed it. And that belief tells us something real. From the very beginning, people felt that Alexandria needed a founding story bigger than commerce. A city this ambitious could not simply be good business. It had to be destiny. Then comes the detail that every ancient source loves. And it is the image this chapter is named for. Alexander wanted to mark out the city plan himself. The walls, the main streets, the districts. But according to the accounts of Plutarch and the historian Arrian, the surveyors had no chalk, so they used what the army had in abundance: barley flour. Alexander and his engineers walked the ground, pouring lines of flour to trace the shape of a city that did not exist. Avenues and market squares and temple precincts sketched in white powder on dark earth. And then the birds came. Flocks of seabirds and marsh birds rose off the lake, descended on the lines, and ate the city. Every boundary, every avenue, every wall, devoured in front of the king who had never lost a battle. The men around Alexander went quiet, because in their world this was an omen, and it looked like a catastrophic one. It was Alexander's seers who turned it around. The most famous version of their interpretation survives in Arrian. The city would be so abundant, they said, that it would feed the whole world. The birds were not destroying Alexandria. They were the first of the millions who would come to be fed by it. Now, a storyteller owes you honesty here. This scene appears in sources written centuries later, and omen stories in ancient texts are usually shaped after the fact by writers who already knew how things turned out. The birds may never have happened, but notice what the story chooses to predict. Not that Alexandria would be the strongest city, or the largest, or the most beautiful, that it would feed people, and for most of the next 1,000 years, that is precisely what Alexandria did. Its grain ships fed Rome. Later they fed Constantinople. Emperors rose and fell, depending on whether the Alexandrian fleet sailed on time. Whoever first told the bird story, and whenever they told it, they understood exactly what this city was for. The physical plan was another matter, and ancient tradition credits it to a professional, an architect named Dinocrates. The design he is associated with was radical for its moment. Alexandria was not going to grow the way old cities grew, tangled lanes accumulating over centuries. It was laid out in advance, on a grid, with two colossal main streets crossing at the center. Streets so wide that ancient visitors wrote about them with disbelief. A planned city, built from nothing, by decision, centuries later, when governments would raise new capitals out of empty ground by decree. They would be following a template first traced in barley flour on an Egyptian beach. And here is the strangest fact in this entire chapter, the one that most people have never heard. Alexander left. Soon afterward, he traveled west to the desert oracle at Siwa, then turned east to finish his war against Persia, then pushed on toward India, chasing the edge of the world. He never came back. The most famous city bearing his name, the city that carried the word Alexandria across 4 continents and 23 centuries, and its founder never saw a single building rise. Not one street, not one wall. He saw lines of flour and birds eating them. And then he rode away. 8 years later, in 323 BC, Alexander died in Babylon. He was 32. His generals gathered around the deathbed of a man who had conquered everything from Greece to the Indus Valley. And they asked him the only question that mattered: who gets the empire? The answer that came down through the ancient sources is 2 words. To the strongest. Whether he really said it, no one can prove. What is certain is what happened next. The generals tore the empire apart in 40 years of war. And one of them, a shrewd and patient Macedonian named Ptolemy, grabbed the richest and most defensible prize of all, Egypt, and with it, a construction site by the sea, half-streets and scaffolding, that was about to become his capital. But before Ptolemy could truly own Alexandria, he decided he needed one more thing. Not a treasure, not an army, a body. What he did to get it is one of the boldest heists in ancient history. And it is where our story goes next. Chapter 2. The Stolen Corpse. In the winter of 322 BC, a funeral procession was moving slowly across the Middle East, and it was carrying the most valuable object on earth. At its center rolled a carriage that ancient writers described with awe. The historian Diodorus, who left us the fullest account, describes a golden temple on wheels, drawn by dozens of mules, its roof glittering with gemstones, its interior holding a golden coffin. Inside that coffin lay the body of Alexander the Great, embalmed by Egyptian and Chaldean specialists, preserved as if he were only sleeping. The procession itself had taken 2 years to build. Think about that. For 2 years, while the empire began to tear itself apart, teams of craftsmen labored over the container for a dead man, because everyone involved understood that this was not a funeral. It was a coronation waiting for whoever was bold enough to claim it. The procession had left Babylon and was heading west. The official destination was Macedonia, the homeland where Alexander would be buried among his ancestors like every Macedonian king before him. The body never got there. Somewhere in Syria, the procession was met by an army. It belonged to Ptolemy, the general who had claimed Egypt, and what happened next was, depending on which side told the story, either an escort or a hijacking. Ptolemy took control of the funeral carriage and turned it south. The most famous corpse in the world was going to Egypt. To understand why a serious, calculating man would risk war over a dead body, you have to understand what that body meant. In the Macedonian tradition, burying the previous king was part of how the next king proved his right to rule. Every general carving up Alexander's empire claimed to be his true successor. But claims were words. Ptolemy now held something better than words. He held Alexander himself. Whoever possessed the body possessed the founder, and whoever possessed the founder could argue that his kingdom, not the others, was the real continuation of Alexander's world. There was very likely a superstition in play as well. A prophecy circulated in the ancient sources that the land holding Alexander's remains would never be conquered. Did Ptolemy believe it? We cannot see into his mind, but he acted like a man who wanted every form of insurance available, divine ones included. Ancient accounts differ on the details of what happened next, and it is worth being honest about that. The body appears to have rested first at Memphis, the old Egyptian capital, before being moved to Alexandria, possibly a generation later under Ptolemy's son. Eventually, it lay in a monumental tomb in the heart of the city, a site the Greeks called the Sema. It became one of Alexandria's most revered landmarks. Julius Caesar visited it. The Emperor Augustus visited it. And according to a story told by the Roman historian Cassius Dio, he leaned in to touch the preserved face and accidentally broke off a piece of the nose. A strange, human, slightly horrifying detail. And the ancient world repeated it for centuries. And then, at some point in late antiquity, the tomb simply vanishes from the record. War, riots, earthquakes, rising ground, a changing religion. By around 400 AD, writers were already asking where Alexander's tomb was, and no one could answer. People have been searching ever since. To this day, in 2026, archaeologists have not found it. Somewhere under the streets and apartment blocks of modern Alexandria, one of the most famous men in history is probably still lying in the city he drew in flour and never saw. But the theft of the body tells us something bigger. And this is the point of the whole chapter. Think about Ptolemy's position. He was a Macedonian soldier ruling Egypt, a land whose language he did not speak, whose gods he had not grown up with, whose civilization was already older to him than the Roman Empire is to us. Egypt had an ancient people. His dynasty had no ancient people of its own, and his new capital had no history at all. Alexandria, in 320 BC, was scaffolding and fresh streets and immigrants. No ancestors, no legends, no roots. So Ptolemy set about manufacturing legitimacy out of symbols. And he did it with unusual deliberation. He took a founder's body, the way a new nation designs a flag. He presented himself as Pharaoh to the Egyptians and as a Greek king to the Greeks, appearing in temple carvings, wearing the ancient crowns, while his coins showed a clean-shaven Macedonian face. His dynasty also threw its weight behind the cult of Serapis, a god whose worship blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, so that both halves of the kingdom could recognize something of themselves at the same altar. How much of that blending was cold political design, and how much grew on its own? Scholars still debate. What is clear is that the Ptolemies promoted it, funded it, and built its greatest temple in their capital. Paris grew out of a tribe. Boston grew out of a congregation. Alexandria was assembled, on purpose, from imported parts, a Macedonian dynasty, a Greek language, an Egyptian throne, and a stolen corpse. It was a city built on an idea rather than an inheritance. That is a strikingly modern kind of city, and it carried a strikingly modern kind of weakness. An idea has to keep justifying itself. A city with no ancient roots has to keep giving the world a reason to take it seriously. Ptolemy understood this better than anyone, and so, sometime around 300 BC, he and his son began pouring the wealth of Egypt into a project that had no military value, no agricultural value, and no obvious commercial value at all. They started buying books, as many as the world would sell them, and some the world would not. Chapter 3. The machine that ate books, somewhere in Alexandria. In the early years of the 3rd century BC, there was a room where ship's cargo was inspected. We do not know what it looked like, but we have a description of what happened in it, because the practice became famous enough that a medical writer named Galen was still describing it 400 years later. And everything in this next scene rests on his late account. When a ship docked at Alexandria, Galen says, officials came aboard, and they were not only looking for smuggled goods or unpaid taxes, they were looking for books, any scroll found on board, a merchant's copy of Homer, a medical text, a treatise on farming, could be seized and carried off to the royal library. Scribes copied it. And then, according to Galen, the library kept the original and handed the copy back to the owner. Read that again. Because if it is even half true, it is one of the most revealing policies in the ancient world. The state of Egypt confiscating originals and returning duplicates. Books treated the way other kingdoms treated gold. Galen even tells us that scrolls acquired this way were labeled with a special phrase. From the ships, was Galen exaggerating a story that had grown for 4 centuries? Possibly. Some historians suspect exactly that. But the picture fits everything else we know about how far the Ptolemies were willing to go. And Galen gives us a second example with more detail. The official texts of the great Athenian playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, were kept in Athens as state treasures. Ptolemy III asked to borrow them for copying and put down an enormous deposit of silver as a guarantee. Then he kept the originals, sent Athens the copies, and let Athens keep the money. He paid a fortune. In effect, to own the real thing. It may be the most expensive library fine in human history. Step back and ask the obvious question. Why? Why would a dynasty of hard-headed Macedonian generals spend a measurable fraction of the richest treasury in the Mediterranean on literature? The answer begins with a refugee. Around 295 BC, a politician named Demetrius of Phalerum arrived in Alexandria. He had governed Athens for a decade, been overthrown, and fled. He was also a product of the philosophical school founded by Aristotle, and he carried with him an idea that Aristotle's circle had pioneered. The idea of systematic collection, that you understand the world by gathering everything, comparing everything, organizing everything. Ancienne tradition, preserved in a document called the Letter of Aristeas and in later writers, credits Demetrius with advising Ptolemy to build a universal library. The Letter of Aristeas is a problematic source, written generations later with its own agenda, so the details are uncertain, but the connection it describes rings true. Alexandria's library was, in a real sense, Aristotle's classroom scaled up to the size of a civilization. What the Ptolemies actually built had 2 parts. And the distinction matters. The famous library was the collection itself, the scrolls. But the beating heart of the project was an institution called the Mauseon, the House of the Muses, the direct ancestor of our word museum. The Mauseon was not a building full of exhibits. It was a residential research community. Scholars were recruited from across the Greek world and given, at royal expense, housing, meals in a common dining hall, salaries, and freedom from taxes. In return, they were expected to do one thing: think, study, write, teach, argue, compare manuscripts, measure the world. If that arrangement sounds familiar, it should. A funded community of researchers living together, freed from ordinary work, organized around a great collection. It anticipates, by more than 2,000 years, the model of the university, the academy, the research institute. The Mausian did not hand later ages a blueprint, but when those ages built their own houses of knowledge, they kept arriving at the shape Alexandria had found first. And beneath the salaried scholars' worked people, this story usually forgets. And this film will not. The copyists, rooms of them, professional scribes, bent over papyrus in the good morning light. Because copying was daytime work and lamp smoke was dangerous around dry scrolls, we do not know a single one of their names. Not one. But every scroll the officials seized at the docks passed through their hands, letter by letter. And everything this library ever was existed because those hands kept moving. Remember them? They are, in the end, what this entire story is about. How big did the collection get? Here you deserve honesty, because this is where myth loves to move in. Ancient figures range wildly, from tens of thousands of scrolls to a famous claim of 700,000. Modern historians treat all of these numbers with suspicion. Ancient writers rounded, exaggerated, and repeated each other, and a single work could fill many scrolls, which makes even honest counts ambiguous. The truthful answer is that nobody knows the number, and anyone who states one as fact is telling you a story, not a statistic. What historians broadly agree on is the ambition, which shows in the acquisition methods themselves, the seized ships, the Athens deposit, the agents sent abroad with purchasing budgets. The surviving traditions portray an appetite approaching universality. Greek works above all, but also texts on Egypt and Babylon written for the new rulers, and scriptures translated from Hebrew. A project we will return to, and the collection created a problem no one had faced at this scale before. A problem you have faced every time you have typed words into a search engine. When you own everything, how do you find anything? The man who answered that question was a poet named Callimachus. Working in the library in the mid-3rd century BC, he produced a monumental catalogue called the Pinnaces, the Tables, said to have filled 120 scrolls. It organized authors by category, attached biographies, listed works, noted opening lines. The Pinnaces itself is lost, surviving only in fragments and quotations, but it stands at the head of a very long family line. The library catalogue, the index, the database, the search result, the tools we use to navigate infinite information descend from a poet drowning in scrolls. Here is the thought to carry out of this chapter, because it reframes everything that follows. We remember the Library of Alexandria as a romantic tragedy, a candle of pure wisdom snuffed out by barbarism. But look at what we have actually seen. Confiscation at the docks, a deliberate swindle of Athens, a collection built as an instrument of prestige, so that a dynasty with no roots could claim to own Greek civilization itself. The project, later remembered as the purest temple of knowledge, was, in its own time, also a machine, funded by grain taxes, powered by acquisition policies that a modern lawyer would call theft, staffed by nameless hands, and aimed at a political goal. It could only run as long as the money and power ran. Hold on to that. It is the key to understanding how the library really died. But before we watch anything die, we have to watch Alexandria show off. Because while the scholars were cataloguing the world's books, engineers out on the island of Pharos were stacking pale stone toward the sky, building a machine of a very different kind. A tower that threw light far out over the night sea, and told every approaching ship exactly what this city thought of itself. That tower is where we go next. Chapter 4. The Lighthouse. Every city builds a symbol of what it wants to be. Athens built a temple. Rome built an arena. Alexandria built a machine for seeing and being seen. Picture the approach from the sea, because that is how almost everyone met this city. You are a sailor in the 3rd century BC, and the Egyptian coast is one of the most dangerous landfalls in the Mediterranean. The shoreline is flat, featureless, without cliffs or mountains, and it hides reefs and sandbars that have been collecting shipwrecks for centuries. On a hazy day, you can run aground before you ever see land. And then, far out, at the edge of sight, you catch a point of light. By day, it is a pale tower with a column of smoke. By night, it is a fire. Lifted impossibly high above the horizon, you steer toward it, and it grows for hours. And by the time your ship passes beneath it, you are craning your neck at one of the tallest structures human beings have ever built. And you know, without anyone saying a word, that you have arrived somewhere unlike anywhere else on earth. That was the Pharos of Alexandria. And that experience, repeated for 1,000 years in the eyes of countless arriving travelers, may have been the most effective piece of advertising in the ancient world. The facts, as best we can reconstruct them. The lighthouse was built on the eastern tip of Pharos Island, begun under Ptolemy I and completed under his son. Probably around 280 BC. Ancienne description, assembled from writers like Strabo and from later Arab visitors who saw it still standing, agree on a 3-stage design, a massive square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top crowned with a statue. Though sources differ on which god or ruler the statue showed, at the summit burned the fire, and later tradition describes polished bronze mirrors that gathered and threw the light. A detail repeated for centuries but impossible now to verify. Ancient claims about how far the light carried vary as well. What we can safely say is that it reached ships tens of kilometers out to sea, which for the ancient world was not navigation. It was sorcery made of engineering. How tall was it? Ancient and medieval figures vary, and no measurement survives from a reliable surveyor. But modern scholars generally estimate somewhere in the range of 100 to 130 meters. Even at the low end, that made it taller than anything human beings had built except the pyramids of Giza, which were already 2,000 years old when the Pharos rose. A skyscraper, in a world of two-story buildings, made of pale limestone and granite that caught the sun. One name attaches to the project, an engineer called Sostratus of Cnidus. And with him comes one of the best stories in this entire history. The story is told by the ancient writer Lucian, who was writing satire centuries later, so treat it as legend rather than verified fact, but it deserves telling. Kings expected their names on their monuments, and Ptolemy's name was duly set into the plaster of the lighthouse. But Sostratus, the story goes, first cut a different inscription into the stone underneath, dedicating the tower in his own name to the saviour gods on behalf of all who sail. Then he covered it with the plaster bearing the king's name. Knowing exactly what decades of salt wind would do, the plaster crumbled. The king's name fell into the sea. The engineer's name emerged from the stone and stayed. True or not, the ancient world loved that story, and you can hear why. It is a quiet argument about what actually lasts. Political power writes its name in plaster. Engineering writes in stone. Now ask the question a skeptical viewer should ask. Why did the Ptolemies do it? A navigational aid did not require a wonder-of-the-world budget. A functional light tower a third the size would have saved just as many ships. The answer is that the Pharos was never only infrastructure. It was a statement aimed at every merchant, ambassador, and rival king who approached by sea. And the statement was this: we can afford to do things no one else can do. The lighthouse and the library were two faces of a single strategy. One projected light outward and said, our wealth is limitless. The other pulled knowledge inward and said, our civilization is supreme. A city with no ancient roots was buying itself a place in history with the two most durable currencies there are, spectacle and knowledge. And the strategy worked so well that it outlived the city's own greatness. The word Pharos escaped from the island and entered the languages of the Mediterranean as the ordinary word for lighthouse itself. Pharos in Greek, Faro in Italian and Spanish, Phare in French. Hundreds of millions of people today say the name of that island every time they mention a lighthouse, and almost none of them know they are doing it. The tower itself had a longer life than the dynasty that built it, and its death was slow. It stood through the Ptolemies, through Rome, through the coming of Islam, damaged by earthquakes again and again across the centuries, repaired, reduced, patched, and diminished, a giant growing old in public. The final blows came from the earthquakes of the 14th century, which brought what remained of the weakened structure down for good. For a century, the ruins lay in a heap on the tip of the island, until, in the 1470s, the Mamluk Sultan Kite Bey built a fortress on the spot, reusing the fallen stones. That fortress still stands. Tourists photograph it every day, and most have no idea that they are looking at a building partly made of a dismembered wonder of the world. And the story has one more turn, the one that brings it into living memory. In the 1990s, French and Egyptian archaeologists began systematic dives in the waters beside the fort, and they found the rest of the lighthouse lying on the seabed. Enormous granite blocks, broken columns, fragments of colossal statues. Imagine being the first diver to descend into that green water and have the face of a stone pharaoh loom up out of the murk. A piece of a wonder of the world that no living person had seen. Pieces have since been raised, studied, and displayed. The light went out 7 centuries ago, but the tower never actually left. It is still there, at the entrance to the harbor, sleeping underwater beside the city, it announced. Ships steered toward that light from every direction, and they carried more than cargo. They carried people, languages, and gods. What those arrivals built inside the walls was something rarer than a lighthouse, and much harder to keep standing. They built the ancient world's greatest experiment in living together. That experiment is our next chapter. Chapter 5. The City of 3 Peoples. Walk through Alexandria in the year 200 BC and use your ears. In the market by the harbor you hear Greek, but a dozen flavors of it. The accents of Athens, Rhodes, Macedonia, Sigilli. From a side street comes Egyptian, the language of the countryside and the old gods, spoken by porters and farmers and priests. In another quarter you hear Aramaic and Hebrew. Down at the docks, the coastal languages of 3 continents. The historian Diodorus, visiting in the 1st century BC, reported that Alexandria was widely regarded as the first city of the civilized world, and modern historians estimate its population in the Roman era at several 100,000, which made it one of the largest cities on the planet. In most rankings, second only to Rome itself, but size was not what made Alexandria unusual. Rome was big. Babylon had been big. What made Alexandria unusual was its recipe. This was a city assembled from scratch out of 3 major communities, and the space between those communities is where both its genius and its violence came from. At the top of the structure stood the Greeks. They filled the government, the Mauseum, the gymnasiums, and the citizen roles, though citizenship itself was a guarded privilege that not even every Greek resident held. For them, Alexandria was the new center of the Greek universe, a bigger and richer Athens. The Egyptians were the overwhelming majority in the surrounding land and a huge presence in the city, concentrated especially in the old western district of Rakotis, the neighborhood that had been a fishing settlement before Alexander ever arrived. They were the farmers, builders, and priests of a civilization already ancient beyond Greek imagination. And under the Ptolemies their position was complicated and, for most, unequal. Legal status varied. Individuals could rise. Priests kept real power in the temples, and the picture shifted across 3 centuries. But the papyrus documents that survive from Ptolemaic Egypt preserve, among the contracts and tax receipts, petitions in which Egyptians protest being abused or insulted by Greeks, sometimes in exactly those words. The resentment was real. It was written down, and it never fully went away. And then there were the Jews. Alexandria became home to one of the largest Jewish communities on earth, with a strong presence in the city's eastern districts. The ancient philosopher Philo, himself an Alexandrian Jew, described a community that was enormous, organized, and deeply woven into the city's life. And in Alexandria, that community did something quietly revolutionary. Living in a Greek-speaking world, many Alexandrian Jews spoke Greek as their first language, and their scriptures were in Hebrew. So, beginning in the 3rd century BC, the scriptures began to be translated into Greek. That body of translation is called the Septuagint, and a famous legend grew around it, preserved in the letter of Aristeas, claiming that 72 scholars were brought to Alexandria at royal invitation and produced the translation for the Great Library. Scholars today treat that account as legend, and the Septuagint itself was not a single book finished in one stroke, but a tradition of translation that grew over generations, beginning in Alexandria. But that it began here is not in doubt, and its consequences are difficult to overstate. This Greek scriptural tradition became the Bible of the early Christian Church. When the authors of the New Testament quote Scripture, they usually quote the Greek forms that flow from the Septuagint tradition begun in Alexandria, which means a translation project in this Egyptian harbor city shaped the exact wording through which billions of people, across 20 centuries, would encounter the Bible. Whatever was later lost in Alexandria, that one export alone changed the world permanently. And think about what that translation required. Physically, Jewish scholars and Greek-trained copyists, side by side, one tradition's holiest words flowing through another tradition's alphabet, sheet after sheet of papyrus, the nameless hands again. Nothing crossed between the communities of Alexandria without passing through them. This is the bright side of the experiment, and it is dazzling. Put 3 civilizations in one walled city, force them to trade and argue and borrow from each other, and you get combinations nobody planned, a god like Serapis, growing where Greek and Egyptian worship met, Greek philosophy absorbing Hebrew scripture in the work of Philo, Egyptian medical knowledge meeting Greek anatomy. Alexandria was a controlled collision of cultures, and the collision threw off light. But diversity under an unequal system stores up pressure. Alexandria's 3 communities did not hold equal rights. Privilege had a hierarchy, and everyone knew it. For long stretches the pressure stayed contained. The Ptolemies needed calm, and the city was rich enough that most people had something to lose. Then Rome took over, and the pressure found its cracks. In the year 38 AD, under Roman rule, Alexandria exploded in violence that some modern historians describe as one of the first recorded pogroms in history. Mobs attacked the Jewish quarter. Synagogues were desecrated, homes plundered, community leaders publicly humiliated and killed, while the Roman governor, by Philo's furious eyewitness account, stood aside, or worse. Philo himself led a Jewish delegation to Rome to plead before the emperor. Decades later, during the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome in 115 to 117 AD, Alexandria's Jewish community rose and was crushed so thoroughly that it nearly vanishes from the record for generations. Hold both truths at once, because Alexandria demands it. The same streets produced the Septuagint and the pogrom of 38. The mixing that created the light also created the friction, and the city never found a permanent way to have one without the other. Every great port city since has lived some version of Alexandria's experiment, and most are still looking for the same answer. But before the violence, in the high noon of the Ptolemies, the experiment's laboratories were still funded and full, and inside them, a collection of individual human minds was quietly producing some of the most astonishing intellectual work our species has ever managed. One of them measured the planet with a stick and a shadow. Another wrote a textbook that was still in classrooms when your great-grandparents were alive. It is time to meet them. Chapter 6. The Mines. Around the year 240 BC, in Alexandria, a librarian looked at a stick, a shadow, and a report from the south of Egypt, and worked out the size of the earth. His name was Eratosthenes, and we will get to what he did, because it may be the single most beautiful calculation in ancient science. But first, you need to understand what kind of place made him possible. Because Eratosthenes was not a lone genius. He was one output of a system, the strange, salaried, argumentative community of the Mausian. And that system concentrated an extraordinary succession of influential minds. If the Pharos was the light Alexandria showed the world, this chapter is about the light it made. Start with the textbook writer. Around 300 BC, a mathematician named Euclid was working in Alexandria. We know almost nothing about his life. And the honest truth is that even the few ancient anecdotes about him were written down centuries later. But we have the book. He gathered the geometry of the Greek world, organized it, and rebuilt it into a single structure called the elements, in which every claim is proven from a handful of starting assumptions, step by step, so that if you accept the first page, logic drags you all the way to the last. It is difficult to name a more influential book that is not a religious text. The Elements was copied in Greek, translated into Arabic, translated into Latin, and became the standard geometry text of civilization after civilization. It was still being used, in recognizable form, in classrooms into the 19th and even 20th centuries. Abraham Lincoln, as a grown man and a working lawyer, taught himself Euclid by lamplight, by his own account, simply to train his mind to reason. When your teacher asked you to prove a statement in geometry class rather than just believe it, you were inside a method perfected in Alexandria 23 centuries ago. The idea that truth is something you construct from starting assumptions, in public, where anyone can check every step, is arguably Alexandria's greatest single contribution. It became one of the operating systems of mathematics, and a model for rigorous reasoning far beyond it. Then came the doctors, and this part of the story is darker and stranger. In the early 3rd century BC, 2 physicians in Alexandria, Herophilus and later Erasistratus, did something that was close to unthinkable in the Greek world. They systematically dissected human bodies. Greek tradition treated the dead body as sacred and untouchable, and for most of antiquity, before and after Alexandria, medical men worked from animals and guesswork. But for a window of a few decades, in this one city, the taboo lifted, apparently with royal support. Herophilus dissected the human brain and described it as the seat of intelligence, at a time when respected authorities placed thought in the heart. He distinguished nerves from blood vessels, studied the eye, the pulse, the reproductive organs, and named parts of the body we still name after his descriptions. He laid foundations for anatomy that would stand for centuries. And there is an accusation attached to this achievement that has to be mentioned. Because honesty demands it, two later ancient writers, including the Roman author Celsus, claimed that the Alexandrian doctors went further than dissecting the dead, that the kings handed over condemned criminals, and that these men were cut open alive. Is the accusation true? Historians remain divided. It appears in hostile sources, generations after the fact, and no contemporary record confirms it. It may be slander against a scandalous practice. It may be a real atrocity. What it tells us, either way, is that Alexandria was a place where the hunger to know had broken loose from the restraints that governed everywhere else. And the ancient world itself was unsettled by what that might mean. Knowledge at any cost is not a modern dilemma. It was already on the table here, alongside the knowledge itself. Now the astronomer, and the claim so far ahead of its time that the world simply set it aside. Aristarchus of Samos worked in the early 3rd century BC. In the wider Greek scientific world that Alexandria had helped define, though how much time he spent in the city itself is uncertain. One short treatise of his survives, but his most famous idea survives mainly because Archimedes, the greatest scientist of the age, recorded it. Aristarchus proposed that the sun, not the earth, sits at the center, and that the earth revolves around it while spinning on its own axis. The heliocentric model, stated plainly, about 18 centuries before Copernicus, and almost nobody accepted it, not because his colleagues were fools, but because the idea ran against both common sense and the physics of the day, and Aristarchus could not supply the missing evidence. The idea was recorded, shelved, and preserved. A correct answer waiting in libraries for a world that could not yet use it. Copernicus, in the 16th century, knew of the ancient heliocentric tradition. The seed the ancient world stored really did sprout, but the wait lasted 1800 years. Libraries do not only hold what we know, they hold what we are not ready for. And finally, the librarian who measured the world. Eratosthenes ran the library in the late 3rd century BC, and his colleagues, the story goes, nicknamed him Beta, second place, because he was excellent at everything and supreme at nothing. Then he did this. Word had it that at Sin, far to the south, near modern Aswan, at noon on the summer solstice, the sun stood so nearly overhead that vertical objects cast no shadow. And later versions of the story add the famous image of sunlight reaching the bottom of a deep well. In Alexandria, at the same season, a vertical rod did cast a shadow, at an angle of about 7 degrees, roughly 1/50th of a full circle. Be careful with the scene, because the beloved details, the well, the perfect simultaneous measurement, come to us through later summaries rather than through Eratosthenes' own lost book. But the method is not in doubt, and the method is the miracle. If the sun's rays arrive parallel, then the difference in shadow angle between two cities can mean only one thing. The ground itself curves between them by 1/50th of a circle. So the distance from Alexandria to Syene must be 1/50th of the distance around the entire Earth. Multiply by 50, and you have the circumference of the planet. His answer, converting his ancient units as best modern scholars can, came out close to the true value. And depending on which historical value of his units you accept, possibly startlingly close. The precision is debated. The reasoning is not no telescope, no expedition, a rod, a shadow, and geometry. Wielded by a man who understood that the universe answers precise questions, he also understood what his answer implied: that the known world was a small patch on an enormous sphere, and ancient geographers after him repeated the thought that one could, in principle, sail west from Spain toward India. 17 centuries later, European navigators raised on the ancient geographers would act on that family of ideas, though the most famous of them, a Genoese sailor, succeeded partly because he badly underestimated the size of the globe that Eratosthenes had measured so well. This chapter has one uncomfortable footnote, and I will not hide it from you. Almost none of these people were born in Alexandria. Euclid, origin unknown. Eratosthenes came from Cyrene, Herophilus from Chalcedon. The city did not grow genius. It bought genius, with salaries and freedom and the greatest collection of books on earth. Exactly the way great universities and laboratories recruit today. Which raises the question that the rest of this story will answer the hard way. If brilliance can be assembled with money, what happens to it when the money, or the will, runs out? The money, in the end, belonged to the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemies had one final ruler coming, the most famous of them all, a woman who spoke the languages of her city, gambled it on 2 Roman generals, and lost everything. Her name has eclipsed the city that made her. It is time to see Cleopatra as Alexandria saw her. Chapter 7. Cleopatra's City. Forget, for the next few minutes, everything the movies gave you. The asp, the eyeliner, the seductress draped across a barge. Start, instead, with a detail from the ancient sources that almost never makes it to the screen, because it tells you more than all of them combined. The historian Plutarch, writing about a century and a half after her death, records that Cleopatra VII spoke many languages, negotiating with Ethiopians, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and others without interpreters. And then he adds the detail that matters most for our story. Her own ancestors, he says, had not even bothered to learn Egyptian. For nearly 300 years, the family that ruled Egypt as pharaohs, the descendants of Ptolemy, the body thief, governed millions of Egyptians in Greek. By Plutarch's account, Cleopatra was the first of her entire line who could speak to her own people in their own language. Hold that fact up to the light. It tells you the dynasty's whole story in one image. A Greek island of power floating on an Egyptian sea for 3 centuries, never fully touching it. And it tells you what kind of ruler Cleopatra was. because learning Egyptian was a choice and a strategy. She presented herself to her subjects as a genuine pharaoh, appearing as the goddess Isis, honoring the temples, investing in the old religion in ways her ancestors had managed only at a distance. She was not an Egyptian queen by blood. She was Macedonian Greek, a daughter of Alexandria. But she was the first of her house to take Egypt itself this seriously, and the temples and priesthoods she cultivated gave her, in return, a base her predecessors never had. She needed every advantage, because the kingdom she inherited in 51 BC was a shadow. After the brilliant early Ptolemies came generations of murderous family politics, brothers marrying sisters and then killing them, mobs in Alexandria making and unmaking kings. Home, meanwhile, had swallowed the entire Mediterranean, and independent Egypt survived mostly because Roman politicians found it more useful as a bank than as a province. Cleopatra came to the throne at about 18, co-ruler with a young brother whose advisors soon drove her out. By 48 BC, she was an exiled queen raising an army, and Rome's civil war was spilling into Egypt. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria chasing his rival Pompey, whom the Egyptian court had murdered on the beach in a catastrophic attempt to please him. What happened next produced the most famous smuggling story in ancient history. Plutarch records that Cleopatra had herself carried through enemy lines to Caesar, concealed in a bedding sack, rolled up and delivered to the palace. Later retellings turned the sack into a rolled carpet, which is how Hollywood stages it. Carpet or sack, the substance is the same, and the substance is not romance. It is nerve. A 21-year-old, locked out of her own capital, gambled her life on getting one private conversation with the most powerful man alive. She got the conversation. She won the man, the war that followed, and her throne back. That war, the Alexandrian War of 48 and 47 BC, matters enormously to our larger story, because this is when fire first enters it. Caesar, besieged in the palace quarter, set the Egyptian fleet ablaze in the harbor, and the fire spread to the shore. Several ancient writers, including Plutarch and the Roman philosopher Seneca, state that the flames destroyed a great number of books, with Seneca citing a figure of 40,000 scrolls. Other writers describe the losses differently, as warehoused scrolls near the docks rather than the library itself. And later, visitors clearly found a functioning scholarly community in the city. Did Caesar burn the library of Alexandria? The honest answer, and we will spend a full chapter on this question, is that he damaged something. The sources disagree on what, and the library's story visibly continues afterward. File the fire of 48 BC as suspect number 1. Questioned, but not yet judged. The trial comes 2 chapters from now. Caesar left Egypt with Cleopatra restored, and she bore a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Then, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated in Rome, and the world broke open again. In the wars that followed, Rome's east fell to Mark Antony, and in 41 BC he summoned the Queen of Egypt to answer for her loyalties. She arrived, by Plutarch's famous description, on a barge with a gilded stern and purple sails, dressed as the goddess of love. It is the most theatrical entrance in ancient literature. And it worked. But be careful what you conclude from it. Strip away the perfume, and what Antony and Cleopatra had was a hard interstate bargain. He needed Egypt's grain and money for his wars. She needed Roman protection and territory for her kingdom and her son. That the alliance also became, by the surviving accounts, a genuine and consuming relationship does not change what it was underneath. Alexandria was betting its independence on picking the winning Roman. For nearly a decade, the bet looked brilliant. Antony granted territories to Cleopatra and her children in a grand ceremony, Romans called the Donations of Alexandria. The city glittered as the capital of a resurgent Greek East, the last great rival to Rome itself. In Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, turned that glitter into a weapon, painting Antony as a Roman lost to an Eastern queen. The propaganda war, historians note, was fought as ruthlessly as the naval one, and much of the Cleopatra legend we inherited, the schemer, the seductress, was manufactured in it. History is written by winners, and Octavian won. The end came quickly. At Actium, in 31 BC, off the Greek coast, the fleets met, and Antony and Cleopatra's force was shattered. The two fled to Alexandria, and in the summer of 30 BC, with Octavian's army at the gates, Antony drove his own sword into his body and died of the wound. By the ancient accounts in Cleopatra's arms, Cleopatra, captured and facing display in a Roman triumph, died days later, by suicide, at 39, the famous asp, the poisonous snake smuggled past her guards, comes from ancient accounts including Plutarch, who himself notes that nobody knew for certain how she did it. Even her death arrives with a source citation and a question mark. Octavian had Caesarion killed. The line of Ptolemy, which had begun with a stolen corpse, ended with a murdered teenager. And here is the reframing this chapter exists for. We tell Cleopatra's story as a romance that failed. Alexandria experienced it as an annexation. In 30 BC, the city stopped being a capital, the seat of its own kings, and became property, the personal estate of the Roman emperor, its grain fleets feeding Roman crowds, its treasures funding Roman armies. The city that had spent 3 centuries buying civilization itself now belonged to someone else's civilization. Alexandria would remain enormous, rich, and brilliant under Rome for centuries. But something had changed at the root. The library's founding patrons were gone. The machine that ate books now had an absentee owner. And machines with absentee owners do not usually burn down. They rust. How the greatest library on earth actually died. And who, if anyone, deserves the blame, is the question we take up next. It is time for the trial. Chapter 8. Who really burned the library? Type the words Library of Alexandria into any search engine, any forum, any comment section, and within minutes you will find the same argument that has been running for centuries. Someone burned it. Someone destroyed the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world in one terrible act. And if we could just name the culprit, we could name the moment civilization stumbled. So let us hold the trial properly. 4 suspects have been accused across the centuries. We will examine each one, look at the actual evidence, and see what survives cross-examination. And I will tell you now, what emerges at the end is stranger and more unsettling than any of the accusations. Suspect number 1, Julius Caesar, 48 BC. We met this fire in the last chapter. Caesar, besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria, burned the Egyptian fleet, and the fire jumped to the shore. The philosopher Seneca, writing about a century later, states that 40,000 scrolls burned, and he cites the historian Livy as his source. Plutarch goes further and says the fire destroyed the great library. So the case looks strong. But now the cross-examination. The geographer Strabo visited Alexandria about 20 years after the fire and worked there. And his writings describe the Museion as a functioning institution, scholars, dining hall, ongoing work. Later, writers describe Alexandrian scholarship continuing for centuries, and some ancient accounts suggest that what burned was not the library building at all, but scrolls stored in warehouses near the docks, possibly awaiting export or cataloguing. We should be careful here, because the Museion and the book collection were not necessarily the same thing, and one surviving does not prove the other did. What we can say is this: Caesar's fire destroyed books. The sources agree on that much, and the numbers and locations blur. But scholarly life in Alexandria demonstrably continued. The evidence does not support convicting Caesar of destroying the entire institution. A wounding, then perhaps a serious one, not proven to be the killing. Suspect number 2, the Emperor Aurelian. In the 270s AD, this suspect has no famous story attached, and that is exactly why he deserves attention. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire nearly came apart, and Alexandria was repeatedly caught in the wreckage. When the breakaway kingdom of Palmyra seized Egypt, Rome took it back by force, and the fighting under Aurelian devastated the very district of Alexandria where the palaces stood. The district that had housed the Museion for 5 centuries. The ancient writer Ammianus Marcellinus, a century later, describes that whole royal quarter as having been destroyed. Decades after Aurelian, the Emperor Diocletian sacked the rebellious city again. Notice what we do not have here. No dramatic scene, no named villain with a torch, no date of death for the library. What we have is the neighborhood that contained the library being ground down across decades of civil war. And after this period, references to the Great Library as a living institution essentially fade out of the historical record. If you forced me to point at the years when the Royal Library, as an institution, most likely stopped existing in any meaningful form, the evidence points here to the anonymous violence of the 3rd century. But notice also what that means. The candidate with the strongest case is the one with no face and no story. History rarely remembers anonymous decades. It prefers a villain it can look at, which brings us to the suspect with the most famous face of all. Suspect number 3, Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, 391 AD. By the late 4th century, the empire was Christian, and the Emperor Theodosius issued decrees against pagan worship. In Alexandria, tensions between the Christian majority and the remaining pagans broke into street fighting, and the pagans fortified themselves inside the Serapeum, the magnificent temple of Serapis that crowned the city's highest ground, the temple the first Ptolemies had raised for their engineered god. The standoff ended with imperial permission to destroy the temple, and Bishop Theophilus led the demolition. The Serapeum was torn apart, and contemporary accounts describe its destruction in detail. Here is what makes this suspect complicated. The Serapeum had housed a daughter library, an overflow collection said to be open to a wider public, and it had held books for centuries. So did the demolition of 391 burn that collection. The ancient descriptions of the destruction mention the temple, its statues, its treasures. The historian Ammianus, writing shortly before the destruction, describes the Serapeum's libraries using, curiously, the past tense, which some scholars read as a hint that the books were already gone by then. No contemporary account of the demolition specifically describes books burning. The temple died loudly and on the record. Whether any significant library still lived inside it to die too, the sources will not clearly say. The court records deep suspicion, notes the possibility that the shelves were already empty, and moves on. Suspect number 4, Amr ibn al-Az and the Arab conquest, 642 AD. This is the most famous story of all, and it needs to be handled with complete honesty. The tale goes that when the Arab general Amr took Alexandria, he asked the Caliph Omar what to do with the great library, and received a chilling reply. If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary, and if they disagree, they are heretical. So burn them either way. The scrolls, the story says, fueled the city's bathhouses for 6 months. It is a perfect story. It is also, in the judgment of modern historians across the board, almost certainly false. The account first appears in written sources roughly 5 to 6 centuries after the conquest, with no earlier trace, and it surfaces in a period when the tale served contemporary political purposes. Contemporary accounts of the conquest mention no such episode, and by 642, as our whole trial has shown, there is no reliable evidence that the great Ptolemaic library still existed in anything like its original form. There may have been books in Alexandria. There is no credible sign there was still a library of Alexandria. The court dismisses the case entirely, and notes for the record how revealing it is that the most repeated version of the library's death is the one that almost certainly never happened. So who killed the Library of Alexandria? Here is what the evidence actually supports, and it is the thesis of this entire film. The most plausible answer is not one killer, but a long process. Fires wounded it. Wars wrecked its neighborhood. But between the fires and the wars stretch the quiet centuries, and the quiet centuries are where the real dying happened. Go back to what we established in Chapter 3. The library was never only a candle of pure wisdom. It was also a machine, and machines run on fuel. The fuel was money and prestige, supplied by kings who needed to buy legitimacy. When the Ptolemies fell, the fuel line thinned, Roman emperors funded scholarship when it suited them and starved it when distracted. And Egypt's new owners lived a sea away. And there is a physical fact at the center of this that changes everything once you know it. Papyrus, in regular use, is fragile. Handling wears it. Moisture rots it. Insects eat it. And time simply fades the ink. A working library of scrolls was never a vault where knowledge sat safe. It was a relay race. Every text had to be recopied, by hand, onto fresh papyrus, generation after generation, forever, or it quietly ceased to exist. Now think back to those rooms of nameless copyists from Chapter 3, bent over papyrus in the morning light. They were never decoration in this story. They were the library's actual heartbeat. Every year of thinner budgets meant fewer of those hands. A scroll not recopied in one generation became a scroll unreadable in the next. And no one ever had to decide to destroy it. It was enough that no one decided to save it. The fires make the legend, but the arithmetic of neglect makes the truth. The library faded the way a fire goes out when no one feeds it. Not in one roar, but slowly, quietly, over centuries, while an empire that had stopped caring assumed the light would keep itself burning. If that thought feels uncomfortably close to home, hold on to the feeling. We will return to it at the very end of this story. Because our own civilization keeps its memory in a form that has more in common with papyrus than we like to admit. But history, which rarely gives us clean villains, does occasionally give us a clean tragedy. And in the streets of Alexandria, 24 years after the Serapeum fell, the fading age that had built the library found its final symbol. Not in a building, but in a woman. Her name was Hypatia. What the city did to her is the darkest single scene in this story, and we owe it to her to watch. Chapter 9. The Death of Hypatia. In the year 415 AD, one of the most prominent intellectuals in Alexandria was a woman in her middle years who taught philosophy to Christians and pagans alike. And her name was Hypatia. Stop on that sentence, because every part of it is remarkable. 16 centuries ago, in a Roman city, a woman stood at the front of the classroom, and the powerful of the city came to listen. This is not legend. Hypatia is documented by near-contemporary sources, including the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, who wrote within living memory of her death, and letters written to her by one of her own students survive to this day. She was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician of the old scholarly tradition, one of the last members of that world we can name. He trained her, and by every account she surpassed him. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonist philosophy, lectured publicly, and advised the powerful. Socrates Scholasticus writes that she attained such learning that she surpassed the philosophers of her own time, and that magistrates were among those who came to hear her. Her student, Synesius, who later became a Christian bishop, wrote to her with a reverence bordering on devotion. Notice that detail and keep it. A future bishop of the church counted this pagan woman as his beloved teacher. Whatever came later, Alexandria in Hypatia's classroom still worked the way the old Alexandria was supposed to work. Outside her classroom, the city was tearing itself apart. The empire was now officially Christian. The old temples were closed or demolished, and Alexandria's ancient talent for street violence had found new banners. The city's factions now formed around religious identity. Christians, Yevs, and the shrinking pagan community. And at the center of the storm stood two men locked in a power struggle. Jiril, the young and ferociously ambitious bishop of Alexandria, and Orestes, the Roman governor, himself a Christian, who resisted the bishop's expanding grip on civic life. The feud escalated through riots and reprisals. Clashes between factions bloodied the streets. A mob of the bishop's supporters attacked the governor himself, and Orestes barely escaped. The city was splitting into armed camps, and between those camps, visible, respected, and unprotected, stood Hypatia, a trusted counselor of Orestes. Then the rumor started. Socrates Scholasticus records it plainly. Word spread among Cyril's partisans that it was Hypatia who prevented reconciliation between the bishop and the governor, that the pagan philosopher was the obstacle to peace. Modern historians reading the sources tend to see her differently, as a target of opportunity, a way to strike at Orestes through the one prominent figure in his circle who had no army, no office, and no mob of her own. In March of 415, during the season of Lent, a mob, led by a church official named Peter, intercepted Hypatia in the street as she rode home. What follows is recorded by Socrates Scholasticus, a Christian historian who nonetheless condemned the violence committed by fellow Christians. And I will spare you the fullest details. They dragged her from her carriage into a church, stripped her, killed her with broken pieces of pottery and tile, tore her body apart, and burned the remains. Socrates Scholasticus himself, writing as a churchman, calls the deed disgraceful and states that nothing could be further from the spirit of Christianity than allowing massacres and fights of that sort. Whether Cyril personally ordered the murder, the sources do not establish, and historians have argued the question for 16 centuries without resolution. What can be said is that the aftermath was thin. The imperial government did move to tighten rules around the Parabolani. The church's strong-arm brotherhood implicated in the city's violence, but no one was tried for Hypatia's death. And Cyril's power in Alexandria continued to grow. Across the empire, those who still practiced the old philosophy could read the situation perfectly well. The rules had changed. Be careful. Though, with the easy version of this story, the one where Hypatia's death is the moment religion killed science. Real history is less convenient. Hypatia was not killed for her mathematics, and her school of philosophy was itself deeply spiritual. Christians studied under her gladly. Scholarship in Alexandria did not stop the day she died. Philosophers, including pagans, taught in the city for generations afterward, and much of the science of Alexandria would eventually be preserved, translated and extended by scholars of the Islamic world and by Christian monks copying manuscripts through the medieval centuries. Her murder was a targeted political killing in a city consumed by factional war, not a verdict handed down against knowledge itself. And yet the symbol is not wrong either. And here is the meaning this story proposes, offered as interpretation rather than verdict. Think about what Hypatia embodied: a classroom where pagan and Christian sat together, a public square where a philosopher could advise power without joining a faction, a city where the life of the mind stood above the war of identities. That is what bled out in the street that day in 415. The world that built the Mausion had believed, whatever its many sins, that knowledge deserved a protected space at the center of the city. The world that killed Hypatia believed that no space was protected, that everything and everyone must finally choose a side. Between those two beliefs lies the whole distance this story has traveled. What most versions of this story do next is skip ahead. 14 centuries in a single sentence, to Napoleon or to the modern city. We are not going to do that. Because what happened to Alexandria between the Arab conquest and the modern age, the long, quiet centuries that almost no one talks about, is not an empty gap. It is the strangest chapter of all, the story of how one of the greatest cities of the Mediterranean world became a town of a few thousand people, while never quite agreeing to die. That forgotten millennium is where we go next. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Millennium. Here is a number that should not be possible. When Napoleon's expedition landed in Egypt in 1798, French observers recorded the population of Alexandria at roughly 8,000 people. Estimates from travelers of that era vary somewhat. A little lower, a little higher. But the scale is not in dispute. 8,000. In a city whose ancient population historians estimate in the hundreds of thousands, the city of the lighthouse and the library, the city that fed Rome, had contracted to the size of a modest town, huddled on the strip of land between its two old harbors, surrounded by miles of ruins and drifting sand. How does that happen? Not through a single catastrophe. No army razed Alexandria to the ground. No earthquake swallowed it whole. Though earthquakes played their part, what happened to Alexandria across these 11 centuries is something quieter and, if you have followed this story from the beginning, hauntingly familiar. The city declined the way the library declined, not by murder, by the slow removal of its reasons to exist. Begin with the conquest itself. In 641 and 642 AD, Arab armies under the general Amr ibn al-Az took Egypt from a Byzantine empire exhausted by decades of war with Persia. Alexandria, it is worth noting, was not stormed. It was surrendered by treaty, and when a Byzantine fleet briefly retook it a few years later, the Arabs took it back and this time reduced its defenses. But the decision that truly changed Alexandria's fate was not military at all. It was a choice about geography, and it ranks among the most consequential real estate decisions in history. The new rulers did not make Alexandria their capital. They founded a new garrison city called Fustat, far inland, at the head of the Nile Delta, near the ancient river crossing where Memphis had stood for 3,000 years. The reasons historians give are practical. Fustat sat on the road back to Arabia. It commanded the whole river system, and a capital inland was safer from the Byzantine fleets that still ruled parts of the sea. The early caliphates were no strangers to the Mediterranean. They built navies and fought for its islands. but their political center of gravity, and the trade routes that mattered most to them no longer depended on Alexandria the way the Roman grain system had. Fustat grew, absorbed successor cities beside it, and in the 10th century a new dynasty founded a grand capital next door and named it Al-Qahira, the victorious Cairo. Here is the brutal arithmetic of that choice. For 1,000 years, Alexandria had existed as the hinge between Egypt and the Mediterranean, the point where the grain of the Nile met the ships of the sea. Rome had needed that hinge desperately. The new order simply needed it less. Alexander had read the map correctly in 331 BC. The map itself had now been redrawn, and no city, however brilliant, outruns the map changing underneath it. The physical city followed the logic downward, and nature collaborated. The canal connecting Alexandria to the Nile, the city's freshwater lifeline and its commercial artery, required constant dredging, and across the centuries it silted up repeatedly, strangling trade and drinking water alike. Earthquakes, as we saw, finished the lighthouse, and the ground itself betrayed the city. The edge of the delta has been subsiding for many centuries, and through some combination of that slow sinking, earthquakes, and the shifting of the shore, the royal quarters of the Ptolemies, the palace district where Cleopatra had lived, ended up beneath the waters of the harbor. The city at the bottom of the sea, the one we began this film with, was made here, in the quiet centuries, by processes so gradual that no one alive at any given moment would have called them a disaster. And yet, and this is the part of the story that deserves rescuing from the word decline, Alexandria never actually stopped. Follow the travelers through the centuries, and you find not a corpse, but a survivor, living a smaller life. Medieval Arab geographers praised its white stone streets and its markets. In the 12th century, the Andalusian traveller Ibn Jubayr visited and marveled at the ancient columns and at the underground cisterns, the vast vaulted reservoirs beneath the streets that had stored Nile water since antiquity, a hidden second city that kept the visible one alive. The Jewish traveller Benjamin of Tudela, in the same century, described merchants from across the known world trading in Alexandria's markets. The spice trade between the Indian Ocean and Europe still needed a Mediterranean door, and Venice and Genoa kept warehouses and consuls in Alexandria to buy pepper and silk through Egypt. The medieval city was no longer the brain of the world, but it remained one of its doorways, and doorways make a living. And through those same centuries, the quiet work of copying never stopped, across the wider Islamic world to which Alexandria now belonged. Scholars were copying Galen and Euclid and Ptolemy's star tables into Arabic, correcting them, arguing with them in the margins, carrying Greek learning forward on fresh pages while the Greek originals crumbled. The great machine in Alexandria was gone. The relay was not. Remember that, because when we come to weigh what was truly lost, those margins will sit on the scale. 2 blows in the years around 1500 nearly closed the doorway for good. In 1498, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around Africa. And over the following decades, the ocean route ate steadily into the spice traffic that had flowed through Egypt. The old trade did not vanish overnight. Red Sea commerce revived at times. But Alexandria's position as an irreplaceable toll gate between East and West was broken. This time by ship design rather than by armies. And in 1517, the Ottoman Empire conquered Egypt, reducing it from the seat of an empire to a province governed from Istanbul, a provincial town in an empire governed elsewhere, on a weakened trade route, with a silting canal and a sinking shore. By the Seljuk hundreds, the arithmetic had done its work. I want to close this chapter with the picture the French recorded when they arrived in 1798, because it holds 11 centuries in a single image. Alexandria's medieval walls, patched and repatched, still traced a circuit far larger than the town inside needed, and within them stretched not streets but emptiness, rubble mounds, garden plots, and dust, with ancient columns standing alone in the open ground, a city wearing the clothes of a giant, the most famous of those columns, a granite pillar from the Roman era that medieval travelers had misnamed Pompey's Pillar, still rose above the ruins, and Napoleon scholars measured it and puzzled over it, a monument whose original meaning had been forgotten, standing guard over a city that had outlived its own reasons, waiting, though no one could have known it, for its fortunes to turn one more time, because they were about to, within 7 years of the French landing, a soldier of fortune from the Ottoman Balkans would seize power in Cairo, look at the sleeping harbour town, and see exactly what Alexander had seen on the empty beach 21 centuries before. A door to the Mediterranean. The second Alexandria was about to be born, and its rise and its heartbreak are the next chapter. Chapter 11. The Second Alexandria. Cities do not usually get second lives. Babylon never did. Nineveh never did. Of all the great capitals of the ancient world that fell into ruin, almost none ever climbed back to world importance. Alexandria did, and its resurrection began with a man who, by most accounts, could not read until middle age. His name was Muhammad Ali. He was born in the Ottoman Balkans, in what is now Greece, of Albanian origin, and he came to Egypt in 1801 as a junior officer in the Ottoman force sent to expel the French. In the chaos that followed Napoleon's withdrawal, he outmaneuvered every rival, and by 1805 he was governor of Egypt, in name an Ottoman servant, in practice the founder of a dynasty that would rule until 1952. Historians describe him as one of the most effective state builders of the 19th century. What matters for our story is what he understood about geography, because it was exactly what Alexander had understood. Egypt, facing inward, was a farm. Egypt, facing the Mediterranean, was a power, and a Mediterranean Egypt needed Alexandria. So he rebuilt the door between 1818 and 1820. His engineers cut the Mahmoudiya Canal, a fresh channel linking Alexandria to the Nile, replacing the waterway whose silting had strangled the city for centuries. The human cost was terrible, and the sources do not let us look away from it. The canal was dug by conscripted peasant labor on an enormous scale, and accounts from the period report substantial loss of life among the workers, from accidents, disease, and exhaustion. The reported numbers vary widely between sources, and reliable totals do not survive. So this film will not pretend to give you one. What no account disputes is the nature of the bargain. The second Alexandria, like the first, was built on a foundation of unrecorded lives. The results came fast, with water and grain flowing again. The harbour woke up. Muhammad Ali built shipyards and an arsenal, moved much of his government's business to the coast, and opened the door to foreign merchants. And then, in the 1860s, history handed Alexandria a windfall soaked in someone else's blood. The American Civil War cut world markets off from the cotton of the American South, and the mills of England were starving for fibre. Egyptian cotton, long, stapled, and superb, filled the gap, and its price multiplied. Egypt planted cotton everywhere, and every bale of it shipped out through Alexandria. The town of 8,000 became, within 2 generations, a boom city of hundreds of thousands, with banks, exchanges, one of the earliest railway lines outside Europe and North America, connecting it to Cairo in the 1850s, and gaslit boulevards along a grand seafront, and the boom pulled in the world. This is the Alexandria that people still write memoirs about, the cosmopolitan city, and the recipe should sound familiar, because we saw it in Chapter 5. Greeks came back in the tens of thousands, merchants and grocers and cotton brokers, one of the largest Greek communities outside Greece. Italians came, and Maltese, and Armenians, and Syrians and Lebanese, and Jews from across the Mediterranean and the Ottoman lands, building synagogues a few streets from churches of 6 denominations and the city's mosques. By the early 20th century, census figures indicate that around a quarter of the city's people were foreigners, meaning holders of foreign nationality, a category that, under the legal system of the time, included families who had lived in Egypt for generations. Whatever the exact accounting, almost no city on earth could match the mixture. Ancient Alexandria had been Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish. Modern Alexandria was all of that again, plus much of the Mediterranean. But the second Alexandria carried the same flaw as the first, and this time it was written into law. The foreign communities lived under a system of legal privileges called the capitulations, under which European nationals were largely exempt from Egyptian courts and many Egyptian taxes. A Greek cotton broker and the Egyptian porter who carried his bales lived in the same city under different laws. The prosperity was real and profoundly unequal, and every Egyptian in Alexandria knew on whose labor the boulevards rested. In 1882, that pressure met imperial politics. A nationalist movement in the Egyptian army rose against foreign control. Riots in Alexandria killed Europeans and Egyptians both, and a British fleet answered by bombarding the city's forts and seafront. British troops occupied Egypt that year. And though Egypt remained nominally Ottoman and later nominally independent, the British stayed, in one form or another, for 7 decades. The cosmopolitan golden age that Alexandrian memoirs mourn was also, and always, a colonial arrangement. Inside that arrangement, though, the city produced one more gift to world civilization, and it is fitting what kind of gift it was. Words. In a flat on a shabby street called Rue Lepsius, above what literary tradition fondly insists was a house of ill repute. A Greek civil servant named Constantine Cavaphy spent his evenings writing poems that he barely bothered to publish. Verses about the ancient city under the modern one, about Antony losing Alexandria, about barbarians who never arrive. Today he is ranked among the great poets of the 20th century, and his Alexandria, layered, ironic, haunted by its own past, is the city's definitive self-portrait. The English writers followed. E. M. Forster, who wrote a guidebook to the city during the First World War, and Lawrence Durrell, whose Alexandria Quartet novels in the 1950s fixed the city's image in the world's imagination, just as the real thing was vanishing. Alexandria began as a city of the book. It took its leave of world literature as a city in books. Because it was vanishing, the end came with the force of the whole century behind it. In 1952, army officers overthrew the monarchy Muhammad Ali had founded, and Gamal Abdel Nasser's revolution set out to return Egypt to Egyptians, a cause with a century and a half of grievance behind it. In 1956, after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, and in the aftermath, British and French nationals were expelled. For the other communities, the end came by different doors. Some of Egypt's Jews were expelled or detained. Many more left under pressure and fear in waves across the following decade. The Greeks and Italians were mostly never formally expelled at all. But the nationalizations of businesses and property through the early 1960s dissolved the economic world. Their communities had lived on, and they left in the tens of thousands. Family by family, shop by shop, different mechanisms, different years. One direction, to Athens, Rome, Marseille, Tel Aviv, Sydney, Montreal. They call it, in the memoir literature, the Exodus, and the arithmetic tells the story in one line. A city that had been roughly a quarter foreign became, within about 2 decades, overwhelmingly Egyptian. For the second time in its history, Alexandria lost its cosmopolitan mind. And this time we have the photographs. The shuttered department stores with Greek names, the synagogues locked behind gates, the cafes where elderly waiters served a clientele that had sailed away. Understand this chapter's ending honestly, because it resists a simple moral. For the departed communities, it was the death of a homeland, and their grief fills shelves of memoirs. For most Egyptians, it was decolonization, the recovery of their own city from a system that had held them second class on their own soil. And that cause was just. Both truths stand, and neither cancels the other. Alexandria's genius, in both of its lives, was mixture, and in both of its lives the mixture rested on an inequality that could not last. The city of everyone had never quite figured out how to also be a city of equals. It still owed that debt when the ships pulled out. What remained after the Exodus was an Egyptian city of millions, growing fast, facing the same sea, and beneath its harbor, all this time, the first Alexandria had been waiting. In the 1990s, divers went down into the green murk with cameras and measuring tapes, and what they found would give this whole story its final, astonishing turn, the sunken city, and the resurrected library are where we go next. Chapter 12. The City Beneath the Water. In the autumn of 1994, a French archaeologist named Jean-Yves Empereur began systematic dives in the waters beside the fortress of Kite Bay, where the lighthouse once stood, in water so murky that visibility was measured in arm lengths. What his team documented on the seabed staggered even the people who had predicted it. Sphinxes, columns of red granite from Aswan, statues of pharaohs and queens, thousands of architectural blocks, and among them, enormous shattered pieces that matched what a collapsed lighthouse should leave behind, some weighing as much as 70 tons. Picture the work. A diver hangs in the green half-light, running gloved hands over a carved stone face the size of a car, a fragment of a wonder of the world that no living person had ever seen, while the modern harbour traffic rumbles somewhere overhead. For 7 centuries, fishermen had been anchoring above the Pharos without knowing it. And that was only the first act. In the years that followed, a second team led by the French explorer Franck Goddio surveyed the wider harbour, and their sonar and excavation work traced what scholars had long suspected from the ancient texts. Parts identified with the Ptolemaic royal quarter, the palace district Cleopatra ruled, lie beneath the harbour waters, sunk by the slow subsidence and the earthquakes we met in Chapter 10. Divers photographed pavements and fallen columns in the green half-light, and raised statues that had last seen the sun when Rome ruled the world. Farther east along the coast, Goddio's team also located the drowned cities of Canopus and Thonis Heracleon, ports older than Alexandria itself, which had slipped into the sea by the end of antiquity. Be precise about what has and has not been found, because this is where enthusiasm loves to outrun evidence. No diver has found the library. No inscription-reading Mausian has surfaced. Alexander's tomb remains lost. Under the modern city or under the water, no one knows. What the underwater work proved is something both humbler and more moving. The ancient city never left. It is physically present. A few meters down, layer under layer. And the modern city of millions sits directly on top of its own ancestor. In Alexandria, you cannot dig a foundation without the past coming up on the shovel. Archaeologists working ahead of construction crews have recovered mosaics, streets, and a seat called Com El Dika, a remarkable complex of stepped stone halls from late antiquity, rows of benches widely interpreted as lecture rooms, though some scholars read them as spaces for performances or public events. Even with that caution, the image is extraordinary. The city that taught the ancient world, and we may well have found its classrooms, and while the divers were mapping the drowned city, something was rising on the shore that belongs in this story's final act, because history almost never offers a symbol this direct. In 2002, on the eastern harbour, close to where scholars locate the ancient royal quarter, Egypt opened the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a new library of Alexandria, built with UNESCO's backing and contributions from governments around the world. The building itself is an argument. It is a vast disk of granite and glass, tilted toward the sea like a rising sun, and its outer wall is carved with characters from the scripts of the world's languages. The alphabets humanity has used to trap knowledge in stone and ink. Inside is space designed for millions of books, along with museums and research centers. And for a time, it even hosted a backup of part of the Internet's own archive, held in Alexandria, of all places. Such arrangements shift with time and funding, but pause on the idea itself. 16 centuries after the old library faded out of history, the city is again in the business of keeping copies of civilization. You can stand in the reading room today, under the slanted roof full of northern light, and watch students bent over their laptops on the very shore where Callimachus once catalogued the scrolls. Whether the new library will matter to the world the way the old one did is not a question architecture can answer. Institution, as this whole story has taught us, are kept alive by will and money, not by granite. But as a statement of intent, there is nothing else like it on earth. Hiroshima passed a law to remember. Alexandria built its memory a second time, in stone, facing the same sea, the city around it, meanwhile, is living a chapter with nothing nostalgic about it. Modern Alexandria is Egypt's second city and one of the great metropolises of the Mediterranean, home to several million people, crowded, loud, and industrial, running on the port that made it. The door that closed in the 7th century stands open again, and busier than at almost any time in its history. But the sea that made Alexandria is now, quietly, the greatest threat it has ever faced. The city sits on a low coastal strip, parts of it barely above sea level, on a delta edge that is subsiding as the Mediterranean rises. Assessments by Egyptian authorities and international bodies have repeatedly identified Alexandria as one of the world's coastal cities most exposed to rising seas. With projections that vary by scenario but agree on the direction, the city has answered with engineering. Concrete barriers along the seafront. Thousands of blocks laid against the waves. Whether it will be enough across this century, no honest person can say. What can be said carries the whole weight of this story. The first Alexandria is already underwater. The second is in a race with the same sea, and this time everyone can see it coming. 23 centuries, and the story has come full circle to a line drawn against the water. Alexander drew his in barley flour. The modern city draws its in concrete. The sea has never once stopped moving. So we arrive at the final question, the one this whole film has been building toward. We have seen what Alexandria built, and how it faded, and who was blamed, and how it rose again. What we have not yet answered is the question in the title. What, exactly, did humanity lose when it lost the Library of Alexandria? The answer is not what you think, and it is the last chapter. Chapter 13. What was actually lost? Let us try, one last time, to open the doors that no longer exist. Imagine you could walk into the Library of Alexandria at its height, in the 3rd century BC, and read what would be on the shelves that is on no shelf anywhere today. We can actually sketch an answer, because ancient authors quote and mention hundreds of works that later vanished. The plays alone stop the heart. The Athenian tragedians wrote hundreds of dramas between them. Of Aeschylus, 7 survive complete. Of Sophocles, 7 out of more than 120 attested titles. Of Euripide, about 18 or 19, everything else is titles, fragments, quotation, dust. The learned poets and historians of Alexandria itself, mostly gone. Eratosthenes' own book, Measuring the Earth, the one we celebrated in Chapter 6, gone. Known only through summaries by later writers. Entire fields exist for us as rumors. Second-hand descriptions of first-hand works no one will ever read again. So the loss is real, and I will not minimize it. But now let me complicate it. Because the version of this story the internet loves, the one where a single fire set civilization back 1,000 years. And we would have starships by now if the library had lived, does not survive contact with the evidence. And this film has promised you evidence. First, as the trial of Chapter 8 showed, there was no single fire. The library faded across centuries, which means there were centuries of chances to copy what mattered most. And much was copied. That is the crucial, hopeful, usually untold half of the story. The knowledge of Alexandria did not live in one building. It lived in a network, in the daughter collection at the Serapeum, in the libraries of Pergamon and Rhodes and Athens and later Constantinople, in private collections, and in the heads and notebooks of every scholar who studied in Alexandria and went home. When the machine in Alexandria rusted, the network held copies. Euclid survived. Ptolemy's astronomy and geography survived. Much of the medicine survived through Galen. And follow, for a moment, how Byzantine copyists in Constantinople, moving crumbling scrolls onto more durable parchment. The translators of 9th century Baghdad, rendering Alexandria's Greek science into Arabic, extending it, correcting it in the margins. The same quiet work we glimpsed continuing through Alexandria's own forgotten Millennium. Jewish translators in Spain carrying Arabic learning toward Latin. Monks in European scriptoria, copying through the winters, an unbroken relay of nameless hands, exactly like the hands we met in the copying rooms of Chapter 3, passing the flame of text from one perishable surface to the next for 16 centuries, until it reached the printing press, and then us. What was lost was lost. In the end, for one reason above all, somewhere along that relay, for this scroll or that one, no hand picked it up. And what survived because one did. That is the true engine of this entire story. So let it be said plainly, knowledge does not survive because it is precious. It survives because someone, in every single generation, does the unglamorous work of carrying it forward. Now stand back and see what Alexandria actually was. Because after 12 chapters, we can finally say it. The city's greatest creation was not the lighthouse, and not any single discovery, and not even the library as a building. It was an idea, and the idea was this, that the knowledge of the whole human species is one thing, that the plays of Athens and the star tables of Babylon and the scriptures of Jerusalem and the medicine of Egypt belong in the same building. in conversation, catalogued, maintained at public expense, because knowledge belongs to the species and not to any tribe within it. Alexandria did not invent the great library out of nothing. Kings before them, in Nineveh and elsewhere, had gathered royal collections, and the library of Ashurbanipal preserved, among its clay tablets, the epic of Gilgamesh itself. But Alexandria became the most enduring symbol of that idea. Pursued with a scale and ambition and openness the world had not seen before. And it is Alexandria that later ages kept invoking as they built their own libraries and universities and archives. The building died. The idea is one of the most successful survivors in human history. You are, at this moment, using it because you see where this is going. You are watching this through the largest attempt at Alexandria the species has ever made. The Internet is the library dream at planetary scale. More recorded information than any previous generation could have imagined. Reachable from a device in your pocket. It has made each of us richer in text than the entire Mausian. And if this story has done its work, you should now be asking the uncomfortable question, what is our version of the fire? The honest answer is that our fire is the same as theirs, and it is already burning, slowly, the way theirs did. Digital information does not die dramatically. It dies of neglect, exactly as papyrus did. Links rot. Formats become unreadable. Servers go dark when companies fold or budgets end. Studies of the web have found that a large share of pages that existed a decade ago are already gone. And the archivists trying to save what remains describe their work as a constant race against disappearance. Our civilization stores its memory on machines that need electricity, maintenance, and institutions that must be funded, year after year, with no end, and that kind of forever, as Alexandria teaches, is precisely the thing no budget ever guarantees. The scrolls needed copyists in every generation. So do the servers. The technology changed. The contract did not, and so we end where the great stories of cities always end, with what this one asks of us. Hiroshima asks us to remember one morning. Alexandria asks us to remember one duty. The library did not fall to a villain, and it will not be saved by a hero. It faded because remembering is work. Unpaid, unglamorous, invisible while it succeeds. And generation after generation quietly assumed that someone else was doing it. Every archivist, every librarian, every teacher, every person who backs up a family photo or scans a dying language or funds a museum is standing in the longest line of succession this story knows, the line of the nameless copyists, holding the flame that Alexandria held for 6 centuries and then let slip. There is a city at the bottom of the sea, 23 centuries ago. A young man drew it in barley flour, and the birds came down and ate every line. And the seers said, "Do not be afraid. This city will feed the world." They were right. It fed the world knowledge, and the feeding never stopped, because the library was never really the building. It was the choice to keep copying. The choice is now ours. Every generation, forever. The lines are drawn in flower. The birds are always coming. What we keep is what we are.